You're listening to the MurphologyPodcast. Thanks for tuning in to the MurphologyPodcast, aka Murph here, to share interviews about biking experiences from cyclists who have pedaled to places all over the U.S. Each week we will get to know new people and explore new destinations to ride your bike. As you listen to these adventures, you may wonder, why haven't I done that yet? All right, well, on the show today, we have Chris Welch. Hey, Chris, how's it going?
Hey, not too bad. How you doing?
Good. Well, we're recording this the beginning of June, and I can't believe I'm still saying this, but we're still kind of in a weird place as far as how the world is with pandemic stuff. Now we've got some riot stuff going on, so it's just a crazy time to be, don't you think?
Absolutely. It's definitely strange for me because I'm not sure if you knew this or the listeners knew this, but I actually moved from Iowa to Colorado right during the pandemic for work.
Oh, wow.
So it's been an interesting time for me.
Well, at least, luckily, still we can bicycle
Yeah.
and get away from it all, at least if it's only temporary. So anyway, welcome to the podcast. And I'm excited to talk to you a little bit about cycling where you live. And now I know it's Colorado, which is going to be awesome. And I think that you are more into like ultra cycling, gravel, fat bike. Am I correct in saying that?
Yeah, pretty much anything long distance.
Okay.
I used to do a lot of road biking, but I've kind of gotten away from that. Now I'm more gravel and mountain bike and fat bike.
Awesome. Well, why don't we start out by, you think about when you're a kid, everybody kind of goes through that phase where they have a bike and that's their only form of transportation. And then they go to college and maybe get another bike because they need it again for transportation. Then they kind of stop biking, and then they grow up and realize biking is awesome as far as exercise and mental health. So what's your story on getting into cycling as an adult?
So when I was younger, I grew up in Dubuque, Iowa, and my parents used to take me out on the Heritage Trail biking all the
Mm,
time. And so that was really where I found a love for biking.
yeah.
My parents also, were involved with Ragbri, and they took me out and they had bikes. And again, kind of like you said, I went to college. I went to college in Iowa. I went to Northern Iowa. And when I was at Northern Iowa, I biked. It was mostly for transportation. Sometimes it was for a workout, but I would say most of the time it was just to get to class and back. I would lock up my bike at the Northern Iowa dorm, and then I would ride it to class and then
Mm-hmm.
ride it kind of for fitness. Then I went to Creighton for law school in Omaha, and I continued to use that. It was like an older Trek mountain bike that I didn't even know anything about mountain biking. I pretty much was just using it on the roads. So then fast forward a couple of years later, and I was an attorney in Dubuque, my hometown. And one of my coworkers, he knew that I was doing a lot of trail running and a lot of yoga, and I was teaching yoga. And he suggested that I diversify and come to a group ride.
Mm.
And so I borrowed my dad's road bike, which was funny because my dad is 5'6" and I'm 6'4".
Oh.
So there's a huge height discrepancy.
Right.
And I showed up and I loved it, but I struggled to keep up. And so the next day I walked into Free Fly in Dubuque, Iowa. I think this is probably maybe 2014, and bought a Trek road bike. And pretty much the rest was history. I went from road biking in group rides to like later that year, I think I bought my first fat bike, and then started doing fat bike riding. And then I started doing gravel on my fat bike. And then that same coworker, Tom Goodman in Dubuque, talked me into coming to Dirty Kanza with a group from Dubuque.
Mm.
And so I bought my first, I don't even think it was a gravel bike at the time. I think it might have been a cyclocross bike that I could throw bigger tires on. But
Mm-hmm.
I went to Dirty Kanza, and I think that probably started my love affair with doing longer distance events.
Awesome. And for those who don't know, Dirty Kanza is pretty much an ultimate gravel bike ride. I think it's at different lengths. You have to pick your length, right?
Right. So the first year I went, I just did the 100. I've
Mm-hmm.
since done the 200.
Okay.
But it was a good introduction, I think, for anybody that's looking to get into gravel or to get into ultra cycling. I know the Eastern Iowa Dubuque crew tends to go every year, and there's a big group that either does the 100 or the 200. And that was really my first taste of kind of bigger events and longer distance gravel racing.
And I think the unique thing about gravel racing, and I'm saying this because I have not done any gravel racing, but I have interviewed quite a few people in that, like Dirty Kanza is a great example. You don't really know your route, right, ahead of time.
Right.
You just find out on the fly, and you're pretty much on your own the whole time.
Yeah, that's the thing that was, I think the coolest thing for me was that the first year that I went, I kind of thought that it would be all the Dubuque people riding together.
Mm,
And then after maybe the first 10 or 20 miles, it was kind of like every person for themselves.
right.
And then you meet so many people on the course, and that's kind of the cool thing about gravel and about cycling in general is that even some of the friends that I have now in Colorado are people that I met at races in the past. You're out there riding, you're struggling, you're being self-supportive in terms of, stopping if you have a flat and fixing it yourself.
Mm-hmm.
This isn't the pro tour where someone fixes your stuff or someone has to do it
Right.
for you. You have to kind of do it on your own. And so you end up meeting so many people out on the course that are kind of in the same situation as you, or maybe riding at the same pace, or maybe they're struggling like you are, and so you pick each other up.
Mm-hmm. Well, you mentioned a couple things about ties to Iowa, and I'm sure everybody knows by now, if that listens, that I am from Iowa, and I also still live in Iowa. But I also went to UNI, so shout out to the Panthers out there, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And then you said you grew up in Dubuque. Tell us a little bit about, like, do you remember cycling, beyond the Heritage Trail? Like, were you a youngster or more like high school BMXing, that sort of thing?
I was pretty young, and what I mostly remember is my dad taking me over to Wisconsin and riding. Dubuque is nice because it's right on the border of 3 different states.
Mm,
And, even when you're an adult riding in Dubuque, a lot of the riding happens in Wisconsin because the roads are just beautiful.
mm-hmm.
They're all paved. They don't have some of the potholes. Riding in Dubuque, I think, got me ready for riding in the mountains because if you're familiar with that area or the Driftless region, the hills are huge.
Yeah.
And I remember being a kid and trying to ride up the hills or riding on the back of one of my parents' bikes and going up the hills was pretty insane.
Mm-hmm.
But then you get to the Heritage Trail, which is interesting. And that was kind of the bike trail that my parents took me on the most, or that I remember spending the most time biking on. And it's almost completely flat. But it's a beautiful, beautiful trail. It's a trail that I miss. It's a trail that I've used throughout the years, both for racing, for training, for fat biking. And that's kind of where I think as a youngster in that region, you kind of chop your teeth or cut your teeth, I should say, is by riding that trail.
Mm-hmm. Well, now fast forward to living in Colorado. How would you describe the, let's say, like the cycling culture, and then obviously, what you do when you're out cycling?
So I should back up a little bit. I also lived in Des Moines for the past few years.
Oh, okay.
And so I think Des Moines also prepared me for riding in Colorado. But going forward to Colorado, so I moved here, and when I first got here, I wasn't able to ride because I had gotten hit by a car in Des Moines when I was cycling. And so I was coming off a hand injury, but I got here, and I just knew that, that as soon as I could ride, I needed to get out there. The cycling culture here is amazing. I live in Manitou Springs, which is right outside of Colorado Springs.
Okay.
I live in the mountains, so I live at about 7,000 feet. You can see Pikes Peak from my front door. But one of the cool things about living in this area is that the cycling scene, everybody just looks like they're in world-class shape.
Oh, wow.
And the reason is because a lot of the people are either Olympians or former Olympians, and they're used to kind of riding around and doing these routes. So, in Des Moines and Dubuque, when you would look at Strava, you would see people and here it's just crazy because you look at Strava and everybody's either a pro or they're an Olympian. And so, one of the things that shifted for me is that I moved here, and one of the first things people told me to do is that you need to buy a full suspension mountain bike.
Mm.
And so I started calling around, and, with COVID, it's tough to get a bike.
Yeah.
And so I had a shop out of Denver build me up a full suspension mountain bike. And that's kind of become my passion the last month or two is, exploring the mountains, exploring the trails, exploring like the real mountain biking. Not that Iowa doesn't have mountain biking, but this is actually like riding in the mountains mountain biking, which has
Right.
been like a total shock to the system, but also pretty awesome.
Awesome. And I have to throw this in. I just bought my first full suspension bike yesterday, and
Nice.
I'm so excited. They're cutting down it has like carbon handlebars, and they're cutting them down so that they're a little bit more for me at my 5'3". And you're right, there are no mountains in Iowa, but where I am, there are some pretty nice trails that you can get yourself in trouble with. So I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, my first mountain bike race was in Iowa City, Sugar Bottom. I think
Sure,
I did
yeah.
the Sugar Bottom. I don't know if it was called the Endurance Classic or something like that, but it was way too many hours for my mountain bike skills. And I was on my original fat bike, which did not have suspension.
Yeah.
But it was amazing. And there are so many good mountain bike trails, both in Des Moines and Dubuque. Dubuque has a huge network of mountain bike trails now.
Mm-hmm.
And, I've obviously ridden in Cedar Rapids and Iowa City. And I don't want to take away from Iowa because Iowa definitely prepared me for the stuff that I'm facing here. I mean, you
Mm-hmm.
definitely need a full suspension here,
Mm-hmm.
whereas I could get away with sometimes fat biking or even sometimes being on my gravel bike in Iowa. But here, definitely, I'm thankful that I had the experiences that I did riding in Iowa.
Sure, but there's nothing that can beat, like what you said, looking out your front door and seeing a mountain.
Yeah, but that's the hard thing too, is that, Dubuque and Des Moines, I've definitely done it. We can talk about some of the events, some of the amazing events that
Sure,
I've
yeah.
done in Des Moines. And I tell people here, I think Des Moines has the best cycling community in the world.
Mm.
I think you can see that like on social media. I think you can see that with the races.
Mm-hmm.
And, Des Moines and Dubuque, you would do rides and have a ton of elevation gain, which is surprising to people that are listening that aren't from Iowa.
Right.
But here it's just crazy because it's a different type of elevation gain. So when I leave my front door, if I want to just ride from my house, I might have to do 1,000 or 2,000 feet of sustained climbing right away, like right off the bat. So I'll be like at a mile and almost 2,000 feet of elevation gain,
Oh,
which
wow.
is
Wow.
just a shock to the system until you're used to it. So
Yeah.
it's been humbling, but at the same time, I've seen my fitness just like leap forward so quickly in the last few weeks. As
Sure.
I've gone from doing a ton of walking the bike to now I'm able to ride most of the mountains.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess while we're on the topic, let's talk about bikes. I'm hoping that you still have the fat bike and the gravel bike, but listeners always want to know what bike you have.
So I just actually got rid of one of my favorite fat bikes. My original fat bike was a Salsa. Um, I can't remember what the actual brand was, but it was one of the original fat bikes. And actually, one of my friends in Des Moines, he was getting married and he just had a kid, Tyler Johnson. If you're listening, I hope you're using that bike well. But when I left Des Moines in March, I left that fat bike with him. I now have a Salsa Bear Grease, which is a
Oh,
carbon
sure.
fat
Yep.
bike,
Yep.
kind of like the racing fat bike. And I've used that a lot around here. I don't know how big fat biking is yet here. When I first got here, there was snow on the ground. But the problem with the mountains is that with as much sunshine as we get, the snow melts really quickly. I have used that fat bike a few times. There's a bike lodge in my little town here. And so they'll have like live music and stuff like that in the age of COVID where everybody sits 6 feet apart. And
Mm-hmm.
so I've rode that fat bike a few times there. I also have a Salsa Warbird that is damaged from when I got hit by the car in Des Moines. So I'm waiting until my medical claim is over for that, and then I'll
Mm-hmm.
probably fix that up and use that for cyclocross or gravel. I have a Specialized Diverge gravel bike that has been great.
Mm-hmm.
I've been doing some road riding and some gravel riding around here on that route or on that bike. So I go to Strava or I go to Ride with GPS and try to search for gravel rides or, some of the rides that the pros are riding around here. And
Mm-hmm.
I've done that. My newest bike then is the Alchemy Arctos. Alchemy is a Denver brand. They are all American made. And so they're one of the only all carbon made in America bikes.
Excellent.
I thought that was kind of cool. Like I wasn't necessarily like, to be honest, I wasn't, thinking I need an American bike or anything like that. But in the age of COVID, where it's been so hard to get a bike from overseas,
Mm-hmm.
when I called around to the shops looking for mountain bikes, they basically told me your best bet is to wait until the fall. And I did not want to wait until the fall to
Mm-hmm.
mountain bike. And so I
Right.
started calling around looking for local boutique brands. and got keyed into Alchemy, and Alchemy was great. I mean, I drove down to Denver. They met me outside. You know, they had their masks on and everything like that. They fitted me. They got me ready to go. You know, they built everything in-house. It's all carbon. It's a beautiful bike. And so that's been the bike that I've been riding the most lately.
Excellent. And do you do any bike packing when you say ultra-cyclist? Does that mean just for racing, or are you actually bike packing as well?
Yeah, so I have done a ton of bike packing in the past, especially with people from Iowa, which has been super fun. The last time I bike packed in Iowa is kind of a fun story. I went with one of my friends and her daughters, and we left from Des Moines and rode to the drive-in movie theater in Newton, Iowa.
Oh, okay.
And then camped in the grass at the movie theater. I think it was maybe 70 miles each way, which was pretty fun. Here, I've got a ton of ideas for bikepacking. In fact, I think in the next few weekends, I'm probably going to do the Ring the Peak Trail, which leaves basically from my front door in Manitou Springs, goes all the way around Pikes Peak and comes back through Colorado Springs and ends up again back at my front door on the trail. It's about 100 miles maybe and 10,000 feet of elevation gain. So I'm thinking I'm probably going to do it in 2 days on a mountain bike. And then I also have, I'd like to do the Kokopelli Trail, which starts in Colorado and ends in Moab, Utah. And I'm thinking probably of doing that maybe in July on one of the longer weekends and making that a 2-day bikepacking event as well. Though I think that's 140, and I'm not sure what the terrain is like yet. So I'm still kind of in preliminary planning, but I would like to do the Ring the Peak around Pikes Peak in the next few weeks.
And you mentioned July, and so, my Iowa mind right away was like, oh my gosh, it's going to be like 90 degrees. But when you're at high elevation, I'm assuming that the environment's much different.
So it's kind of crazy that you say that, because Saturday I went to Pueblo, which is maybe 45 minutes south. It's like on the way to New Mexico, if you're thinking about geographical locations. And I mountain biked, and it was like 98 degrees.
Oh, really?
And I thought I was going to be in so much trouble, but it's a different type of heat, even in the desert. The only problem I had was that there wasn't any shade. And so riding in that type of terrain without any shade still beat me up, but it didn't have the humidity from the corn like Iowa has. Like when you think about like the humidity when you ride Ragbri or some of the famous summer events in Iowa, you start getting above even 85 degrees and it starts getting intolerable. It wasn't as bad as I thought it was going to be. But when you ride like in Colorado Springs, or you ride in Manitou, or you ride in some of these other high alpine locations, the weather can change so drastically that if you see my pictures, like a lot of times my pictures on Facebook, my friends are like, is this pictures from 3 different rides? I'm like, no, this is pictures from 3 different like locations on the ride, where at some points it's super hot and you're wearing like, your spandex bicycle kit. And then the next minute it's cold because you're at a higher elevation. And so it really just depends. But it's never as hot, especially in Colorado Springs, as it is in Iowa. And so when you're bikepacking, or when you're mountain biking, or when you're road biking, or you're gravel cycling, you really have to be cognizant of the fact that the weather can change extremely quickly. And, I went with some friends to Utah, to the Colorado-Utah border 2 weekends ago for a mountain bike trip. And our pictures were hilarious, because in some of the pictures we're wearing winter clothes and it's snowing. And then like 10 minutes later, we're at a lower elevation and we're in, shorts and t-shirts, or we're in, like the bike kit.
Yeah.
And so, as I said, you just have to really plan for anything when you're on the adventures here, which has been a little bit tough for my brain to process, because I like to be minimalist, especially if I'm just going to do a training ride. And I have to remember that descending is going to feel a lot colder than going up the mountain.
Right. Yeah. You're going to have to pack for 3 seasons almost.
Right.
Yeah. Well, you kind of dabbled a little bit on telling us some of your adventures, but do you want to get into, like, I'm assuming you've done some races, some events, and then of course just adventures with friends, but give us some details. A quick interruption to tell you this week's sponsor is Thirsty Pigs, a full-service mobile event company offering beer, wine, spirits, plus catering for any indoor or outdoor event. Check out more at thirstypigs.com. Now back to the show.
So I think some of my most fun events were in Des Moines. I think Des Moines has such a great cycling scene and such a great cycling culture.
Hmm.
When I lived in Dubuque, one of my favorite things to do was come to Des Moines for some of the events. So some of the events that come to mind that were some of the most epic events were Spotted Horse. I did the first Spotted Horse, Sarah Cooper's race and Steve Fuller's race. I love those two. And I remember doing that race for the first year, maybe in 2015, and thinking that this is where I want to be. These roads are amazing. I want to ride with these people. The same thing for 24 Hours of Cumming, Steve Cannon's race. The first year that I did 24 Hours of Cumming, I had no idea what I signed up for. I did the full 400K, and I did it on my cyclocross bike.
Oh, wow.
And I still tell stories to this day of that, because I had done some night riding in Dubuque, but I had not done night riding to the extent of, you've already got 100 or 200 miles underneath you and you're riding. It was just, for me, that was transformational, riding that route, riding those loops, riding in the Cumming area, riding in, the Winterset area, seeing the bridges of Madison County, seeing all these things that I had heard about in Dubuque, but had never actually ridden or been a part of. And I think that had me hooked, like that adventure, that riding for 24 hours self-contained. And I think that first year that I did 24 Hours of Cumming, I think I probably rode at least 180 miles by myself.
Oh, wow.
Which I was so used to riding with people in Dubuque and, going on adventures and doing it with other people. And at the time I was doing a lot of bike packing, and my sister was living in Colorado Springs. And so I'd gone out to Colorado Springs and bike packed and done a ton of gravel that summer. But nothing, I don't think, prepared me for being alone in the hills of Iowa and the gravel of Iowa for almost, maybe 21, 22 hours. And so that was transformational. And so,
and I want to point out, I wanted to point out that both of those events you just described are gravel. And if I remember right, most years it's miserable weather.
Yeah. So I got really lucky the first year that I did Spotted Horse and the first year that I did 24 Hours of Cumming, because every other year I think it's been miserable. And the first year that I did both those races, it was perfect.
Oh,
like
great.
70-degree temperatures.
Yeah.
I think 24 Hours of Cumming that year got really, really hot during the day. But then by the time that night came, the wind completely died and it actually got a bit chilly. And so it was a welcome reprieve from the miles that I did during the day and the heat of the sun where I kept running out of water.
Yeah.
But you're right, like Spotted Horse normally is a total sufferfest.
Right.
And this year I was actually signed up, and then I think I alluded to earlier, I got hit by a car. I got hit by a distracted driver in Des Moines, like 2 or 3 weeks maybe before the race. And so I told Sarah and Steve, I can be a support driver. And I have never been so glad that I was not able to race, because it was thunderstorms at the start. It was 40 or 50 degrees for the first maybe 50 miles of the race. And I was freezing in my car and miserable in my car, trying to track these racers and trying to stay ahead of the race. And so you're right, like Iowa, you just never know what you're going to get for weather, and especially those longer distance events.
And if you know Sarah Cooper well enough, which you do, she will always pick the routes that will make you suffer, even if there is perfect weather.
Right. So I was actually signed up for Iowa Wind and Rock this year, which for people that don't know is Sarah Cooper and Steve's race. That's basically probably 340 miles at least. They don't really release the course ahead of time, so you don't know what to expect. But it was going to be about 340 miles, probably 30,000 feet of elevation gain, which even people listening in Colorado hear that and they're like, oh my gosh, how are you going to do that? And you're right. Like I've ridden with Sarah and Steve enough, and especially Steve when I lived in Des Moines, that they pick routes to make you hurt.
Yes.
Like they want you to suffer. They want you to find yourself, which I think is great about the Iowa cycling community. It's that if you do these races, even if you don't finish, or even if you have a mechanical or something like that, you've tested yourself, because that you've taken part in an event where the route is not chosen for comfort. The route is not chosen to have everybody finish. The route is chosen to not only include the best that Iowa has to offer, but also the hardest and most difficult routes that Iowa has to offer.
Any other adventures you wanted to touch on?
I think going back to fat biking, I think fat biking is something that really Iowa is known for. And I think the adventure that I'd like to touch on just real briefly in terms of fat biking is, I think one of the very first fat bike adventures that I ever went on is worth exploring. I always did every year the Triple D race in Dubuque, which is, for those that don't know, it's about a 70-mile or maybe 100K fat bike race in the middle of winter in January, generally at like the coldest day of the year. There's been years that I've done it where there's like this year, there was like almost 10 inches of snow and we ended up walking most of it. But other years it's been -40 with the wind chill. There's been years that it's warm but super muddy. It's one of those races that I think tests you. Every year is a different story, but I think one of the coolest experiences or coolest adventures that I had is that in Dubuque, we would always have a huge group that would train together for it. And so we would go out and do fat bike rides or fat bike training rides, months in advance, and start getting our miles up on our fat bikes as soon as road bike or gravel season was over. And I'll never forget, I think it was 2015, and in Dubuque, they lovingly refer to this as the ice ride of death. And the problem with fat biking in Iowa is, again, temperatures and conditions can change so quickly. And so a group of us, maybe 10 or 15 of us in Dubuque, decided to go out on an all-day adventure. I think we were going to do maybe 50 or 60 miles on fat bikes, and we were going to ride out to a new brewery that had just opened outside of Dubuque. And so anyway, we started, and it was a beautiful winter day. There was snow, but it was all rideable snow if you ran a low enough tire pressure.
Mm-hmm.
It was sunny, so the snow was starting to melt. And so we get to the brewery, and everybody's feeling good, but then we realize that the brewery does not have any food.
Oh.
And so people start bunking, and people start saying, like, we need to leave. The temperatures start dropping. All of a sudden, out of nowhere, it starts raining, and so it starts getting icy. And so we leave the brewery, and people are out of water. Their water is frozen. They haven't had food. Everybody's shivering. And the next thing you know, the roads just become super icy.
Oh, no.
But in the spirit of Iowa, we all keep riding and pushing ourselves until finally someone breaks down and is like, I'm going to put out my thumb, and the next, farm truck that I see, I'm going to try to see if I can get a ride back to Dubuque. And so sure enough, they stuck out their thumb, and a farm truck stops and is like, what are you guys doing? Like, you're crazy. Why would you be riding right now? There's an ice storm. And so they take the one guy all the way back to Dubuque so that he can start getting cars. And so depending on how cold or how much everybody was bonking, depended on when you got picked up. And so it basically became okay, let's keep riding so that we can maintain our heat and get close as possible to Dubuque, while at the same time waiting for people to come pick us up. And so we lovingly referred to that as the ice ride of death. Everybody survived. I don't think anybody got frostbite. But those are kind of the adventures that Iowa is known for, like where it's just all day, adventures with friends. A lot of times you're sticking in beautiful scenery at breweries, different types of people. I think the cool thing about those adventures in Iowa is that it brings out everybody. Like there was, every type of person on that ride, and yet we all survived. We all kind of banded together, and it was all about the bikes, but it was also all about being safe and making sure that we all got home in one piece. Those are the adventures that then prep you for the races and prep you for the events. And every year that those stories or those pictures show up on Facebook, people are always sharing it, like, oh, do you remember this? And lovingly, we think about that, even though it was one of the toughest days of my life and one of the scariest in terms of the temperature changes and ice. It's still one of those things that I think makes, the Iowa riding scene so special.
Yeah. And it's a perfect example of, when you were living that day, you probably were like second guessing, like, am I going to make it till the guy comes and picks me up?
Right.
Like you were terrified, but then I bet you, it took maybe a couple days. You got everything thought out, had a good meal, and then you're like, yeah, that was awesome.
Right.
Maybe you don't want to do it again, but anyway.
Well, we say that every year about Triple D, and yet it's usually like a few days afterwards that everybody kind of comes together again.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, yeah, I really want to do that. In fact, this year was one of those years that was like, we had gone, I don't know if you remember Triple D this year, but there was a crazy snowstorm like the night or day before.
Yeah.
And so I was actually with a big group from Des Moines, and we were driving to Dubuque and barely missed getting stuck in a snowstorm. And then we get to Dubuque and we all went out to eat. And I remember like the night before the race, everybody from Des Moines really had no idea, other than Scott Sumter from Bike Iowa. I think nobody else had done the race before except for me. And the nerves was at dinner were just like, it was so palpable. Like everybody was like, oh my gosh. And then the race was miserable. It was
Wasn't it
like,
like 30 mile an hour winds,
yeah, it
like
was like
headwinds both
30 to
ways?
50 mile an hour sustained winds, to the point that I think the first maybe 14 miles, about half of it, we had to walk and push. And even pushing the bike was
Wow.
tough with the fresh snow and wind.
Yeah.
And then we got to the first checkpoint, and there was roads, and I knew that if we got all the way down to the Heritage Trail, we'd be fine in terms of finishing. And so I remember I was with Jen Borst from Des Moines, and we decided to stay together for warmth and just for safety purposes. And we were riding like on the road leaving Junction 21. And we thought, okay, finally we get to ride our bikes. And the wind was so strong that we both got knocked off our bikes riding on the road.
Wow.
And it was just like, what are we doing? But anyway, we were driving back to, or we were at the end of the race, we were all kind of sitting around and we were talking about, how we had to drive back to Des Moines. We decided to stay because of the weather for an extra night. And I remember that the two other people that I went with, Shelby Cork and Jen Borst from Des Moines, we were all like, oh, that was terrible. Like, why do we sign up for this stuff? Why do we pay money? But then the next day we were driving back to Des Moines, and the three of us were like already planning 2021, saying like what we would do different and how we were going to stay together better, and just the training that was needed to like go through that. So
Yeah.
you're right, like all these events, at the time you're thinking in your head, oh my gosh, like how am I doing this? And I would never do this again. And why do I sign up and pay money to get tortured like this?
Yeah.
And then the next day or the next week or the next month,
Yeah,
like,
you're
oh,
like,
I can't wait for next year.
That's how I am with Ragbri. I've done Ragbri, I think 26 times. And there's always a moment during Ragbri where I'm like, this is it. I am never doing this again.
Yeah.
It's too hot. It's too hilly. It's too windy, whatever. And then, it takes me 2 or 3 days where I'm like, okay, here's what I'm going to do different next year. So anyway, do you have any like that was the coolest type moments in any of your races or adventures that you would want to share?
I think the coolest adventure that I've ever done, and I am really disappointed it got canceled this year because there was a bunch of people from Iowa that were going to come out and do it. In 2016, I did the double triple bypass in Colorado.
Oh, okay.
And for those that don't know, it's 6 mountain passes, and it's an out and back over the course of 2 days, 240 miles. I think it was maybe 22,000 feet of elevation gain. And I think the coolest part of that event was the camaraderie of all of us from Iowa training for it. People laugh when we said we trained for it in Iowa, but again, Iowa is super hilly, and there's definitely portions where, there's portions of Dubuque that feel exactly like riding into the mountains. It may not be the same amount of sustained climbs, but when you get outside of Dubuque, when you get in the driftless region, there's definitely climbs that prepare you for Iowa. And so we trained for months and months and months. There was probably a group of maybe 20 or 25 people from Iowa that went. And I remember just the awe of coming from Iowa and riding in the mountains and, doing this 2-day adventure where we're all sticking together, and the scenery was just incredible, and it wasn't a race. And so we weren't racing against the clock. And so we were taking advantage of the views and, just of the ride and the miles and, being on the roads and descending mountain passes and climbing mountain passes. And, and then also like the joy of riding up these mountains and wearing Iowa jerseys or wearing Ragbri jerseys, and having people from Colorado be like, you guys are from Iowa. Like, that's crazy. I can't believe that you can do this. And so that was amazing. And, I'm disappointed, in the age of COVID, I think just about everything's canceled. And or everything's continued. And so it's one of the casualties of the COVID, but it's also one of those rides that I hope that people continue to partake in and continue to train for in Iowa, because I think it's, it's a once in a lifetime experience to be able to train in Iowa and then come out here and do something as epic as 240 miles and in 20 some thousand feet of elevation gain.
Right. And so I've heard of triple bypass where you are doing 3 mountain passes. So is double triple meaning you're coming back? Like you're going?
Yeah. So double triple, you wake up then the next morning. So you sleep overnight then, and then you wake up and ride the route in reverse.
Okay. Wow.
So you really are maximizing, the weekend and the riding. And, I was just telling some friends from here, because actually on our way to Utah, we passed through some of those mountain passes, and I was so tempted to get off and ride up some of the mountain passes, but I think that they're pretty snowy yet. when you go in reverse, you actually see, I mean, you see the other side of the mountain and you see things in a different light because, when you're descending the mountains, it's beautiful, but you're really paying attention to the road because
Right.
you're going so fast and it's
Right.
so sketchy. When you're climbing the other side of the mountain, it's like, oh my gosh, I don't remember this from yesterday.
Yeah.
And it's just a completely different challenge. And, even if the listeners are thinking about doing it and only want to do one day, they have shuttles that take you back to the start after the first day. And even one day, I think, will really whet your appetite for mountain riding and for, riding in beautiful places and also, road riding. I think that at the time, I think that I was kind of starting to get more into gravel than road riding. And I think that really kind of kept my passion going for, there's a place for road riding still in our world. And it was gorgeous. And then it was so cool too to see all the Iowa people, because I think everybody from Iowa got the memo that you're either going to wear a RAGBRAI jersey or you're going to wear your Iowa team jersey or you're going to wear your collegiate. Like I think the first day I wore my Northern Iowa jersey, and then the second day I might have worn like a RAGBRAI jersey so that people knew that I was from Iowa. And I think that was the amazing thing, is that like there were so many other people from Iowa that were there, and including, if you're familiar with like the RAGBRAI scene, Team Bad Boy was there that year. And I remember Steve
with their gear.
Yeah, with all their gear, because I remember like we looked back and we're like, are these guys really climbing a mountain with everything but the kitchen sink? And then the kitchen sink comes rolling by and the music, and they had a wet bar, and it was like, this is crazy. And then to learn that, to have the Colorado people learn, including my sister who rode with me that year, and she was living in Colorado. When she heard that team was from Iowa and that they were doing that, it was like, oh my gosh, Iowa has the raddest cycling scene in the world.
Yeah, nowadays I do RAGBRAI self-contained. And so whenever we're, sitting on the side of the road having a drink or something, when you see Team Bad Boy pedal by, you are way, way behind. Like, because they just, they're just on their own schedule, and they literally, I mean, if you guys, I don't know if they have a website, but they literally have a kitchen sink on the back of their bike, and another guy has a full bar on the back of his bike. It's crazy.
Yeah.
Oh, that's awesome. A quick interruption to tell you this week's podcast is sponsored by Lizard Lips Lip Balm. These great lip balms contain natural ingredients, come in a variety of flavors, and you can choose certified organic or balms with sun protection. Check it out at lizardlips.net. Now back to the show. Okay, so back to bikepacking. I do ask this question a lot, and it's always fun, and maybe you don't have an answer for it, but do you carry any luxury items that you don't really need, but you take anyway just because they make you feel better?
I don't think so. I thought about that because I've been doing a lot with my hand injury, and I'm biking again now. I've been doing a lot of backpacking. And so I usually take like a book or two. I guess that's the biggest luxury item I've taken. And sometimes those don't fit the best. I just did a backpacking trip with all my bikepacking trip where I basically hiked from my front door and went up Pikes Peak. And I went up about 5 or 6 miles, and then I unpacked all my backpacking stuff. And it's weird here because you have to save more space for bear protection.
Oh.
In Iowa, you can bikepack, and like when I talked about that adventure the last time I bikepacked in Iowa was when we went to the drive-in movie theater. We had a ton of space for, like alcohol and, cards and books. But here you have to have like a bear canister or, like a bear bag and like bear spray. And so I found myself packing completely different and like, okay, what can I take for the bear minimalist to also be light? Because some of that stuff gets heavy.
Right.
I made the mistake of, I haven't lived here long enough to know how to stay ultralight in bear country. And so I took a bear canister, which was super heavy and a bad idea for anybody that's listening. If you're going to be solo and not car camping or not truck camping, do not take a bear canister. Try to take a bear bag that you can string up on a tree. But I took a book, and it's in the age of COVID, I wanted some inspiration. And so I took David Goggins, I think it was called You Can't Hurt Me. And that was epic. A lot of times when I bikepack, I'll take a hammock with me, and I'll try to just like lay in the hammock and read. And that's kind of the oddities that I bring, is that a lot of times I'm going places either bikepacking or backpacking where I'm not going to get cell phone service. And so you need to think ahead about how you're going to entertain yourself, especially if you're going by yourself, like I usually do, and you're not going to have cell phone service, it's like, how do I stay sane for 24 or 48 hours or whatever? And for me, that's books. And a lot of times, I guess the other thing that's weird, I think is normal, but I'm kind of a weirdo, is that a lot of times I'll take a yoga mat with me and I will do yoga by myself. I'll meditate by myself. And I think people see me with a yoga mat on my bike and they're like, what the heck? But now that I live in Manitou Springs, Colorado, which for people that don't know about Manitou Springs, it's kind of like the healing capital of Colorado. I see people all the time with yoga mats on their bikes, and it doesn't seem like it's as weird as maybe it was for me when I was riding around. And but I was kind of, I taught yoga in Dubuque, and I would ride my bike to yoga
with
and
your
always
mat.
have my mat on the back. And so I kind of normalized it.
Right.
But now that if I tell other people like what to pack for bike packing, and I would tell them to bring a yoga mat because it can also potentially double as a sleeping mat, people are like, you are so weird.
Well, and I do consider both of those luxury items, like the yoga mat and the book. And the unfortunate thing is they're both like awkwardly bulky. You can't, well, maybe you can do a extra fold on a yoga mat, but it's going to be long. At least it's lightweight, but a book, like you could only roll it up or smush it so much. And it is heavier than you think when you look at a book. But I mean, you're right. Sanity overrides the awkwardness of it.
Right.
Okay, so we are in, the life of COVID right now. So most scheduled events are canceled. But do you have any adventures on your horizon?
I'd like to do the Pikes Peak Trail, so I'd like to do Ring the Peak. There's also a road bike ride coming up that I actually just posted in some Iowa groups. I know that travel is starting to open up a little bit, and I know that they're going to socially distance at this event. But there's an event called the 917 on July 19th here, or 719, I'm sorry, and it's on July 19th here. And the reason it's called 719 is that that's the area code here.
Oh, okay.
And it is going to be 71.9 miles and 10,000 feet of elevation gain.
Whoa.
And so, but it's a road bike ride. And so I don't think that I don't think it'll be as intense as if you were, say, doing a gravel ride or a mountain bike ride or a flat bike ride with that much elevation gain. So I think that that's the next thing on my horizon in July. But I also probably will start sneaking in some bikepacking events over the next few weeks. I just got back from Utah. I went to Flaming Gorge, if anybody knows that area. I did a self-contained dispersed camping weekend and basically bought all my groceries here in Manitou Springs and packed all my water and used big jugs of water so I wouldn't have to stop anywhere. And then basically it's right on the Colorado-Utah-Wyoming border. And so we found camping in the Forest Service free camping area, and then pretty much just mountain biked for 4 days, which was amazing. So I'm still kind of recovering from that. Otherwise, to tell you the truth, I'm so new to Colorado in this area that every day feels like an adventure. Like I can do so many different types of rides in terms of mountain biking or gravel or road. And, there's so many loops. And as I said, I mentioned earlier, I just got back from the desert this weekend. And it's crazy to me that the desert's 45 minutes away. And it's, such a palpable change in terms of the lack of trees and also the temperatures are so much warmer. But that's nice for me because it tends to rain a little bit each day here, even though it's sunny. Like I can't think of any days that I've lived here in the past few months where it's been cloudy or anything like that, sunny every day. But there's at least maybe 45 minutes every day where crazy storms come through over the mountains.
Really?
And so Pueblo, a lot of people go and ride there because it's the desert and it's dry every day, all day. And so that's kind of like the mecca for mountain biking close to here. I'd also like to, as things start to open up, I'd love to do some other adventures in Colorado. I need to get to Salida. I need to get to Moab and Utah. And so those are all adventures that'll come without racing. I'm bummed that all the Iowa races are canceled because I definitely had planned a return. I was really excited for Ragbri this year. In fact, there's a bike lodge here in Manitou Springs. If anybody comes to visit or comes to visit me, it's a great place to stay. It's kind of like a ski resort that's actually a bike lodge, resort. Okay. That's like ski themed, and they do group rides, but they also host cyclists and let cyclists sleep there. And they have their own team that does RAGBRAI every year. And so I was planning on doing RAGBRAI with them and kind of meeting the new Colorado friends and then also connecting with old Iowa friends.
Yeah.
And so, I think to replace some of that stuff, it's just going to be local adventures. Then it's going to be as we're allowed to expand, I think going further in my radius and, getting further in terms of, places to mountain bike and places to gravel race and also training for the 719 road race.
Mm-hmm. And you've got, like you mentioned, you've got desert really close, you've got mountains, you've got beauty, you've got, pretty much anything. But I can also say that for Iowa, I really learned this year because of the whole COVID situation, I made choices to go, to explore different places, because I'm like,
right.
I don't want to be on the trails now that everyone else is on the trails, and you can't fault anybody for that. You want people to get out. And so that's, I think, how gravel kind of, came into my life, where I'm like, well, gravel everywhere in Iowa, so let's go explore new places. And I have found some pretty fun, new places to explore, like once we can get back into group riding.
Yeah. I think that's the great thing. I mean, you hate to think of great things with COVID, but I think it has instilled in people a passion again for bikes. I mean, I think that's why you see bikes are so backed up in terms of buying bikes.
Mm-hmm.
But then I've also seen so many people that I know get into gravel because they want to socially distance, because, the trails, as you said, are packed.
Mm-hmm.
You look at the High Trestle Trail in Des Moines, which is one of the most popular trails in Iowa, and it's packed.
Mm-hmm.
And so people are, they're like, I want to explore new roads and I want to explore new disciplines. And, I think a lot of people here are, they're jumping from road to mountain bike to gravel. You see people that are doing these different rides and routes because they want to get away from people and they want to try something different,
Right.
which I hope, as things start to open up and as people get back to normal in terms of group rides and races, I hope that people, utilize these beautiful roads and beautiful routes that they found.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Did you tell me, I think you told me that you found your dog in Iowa?
Yeah, so that's a good story.
Yeah.
So I injured myself on a bike ride. I was doing a winter training ride for Triple D and fell and hurt my spine. And at the time, I didn't know the extent of my injury. And so, like the tough man or tough woman biker of Iowa, I just continued to ride all through the winter and all through the spring. And then actually Dirty Kanza that year in 2017 is where it finally came to a head. I came back from Dirty Kanza from racing 200 miles, and I knew something was seriously wrong. I could not stand up straight. My left leg went numb. My left foot went numb. I knew at that point it was a medical emergency, so I went to the emergency room, and long story short, I had spine surgery.
Oh, wow.
And it was emergency spine surgery. And so it kept me off the bike for a few months. And so it was really tough for me. It was the first time really in my adult life that I was forced off the bike for any length of time. And so I lost a ton of fitness, but I kind of stayed sane by walking and kind of trying to incorporate other activities. I was finally able to ride again, and this would have been August of that year. And I was able to ride, but the doctor warned me, like, you can't ride, like, you can't do the Chris rides that you're used to, like, you can't go out and do 200 miles, like,
right.
This has to be flat, this has to be chill. Like, they recommended I use my fat bike to slow myself down. And anyway, one of my good friends at the time, I'm still good friends with her and still connected with her, and I'm sure a lot of listeners probably know her, Crystal Kovacs. She lives in Wisconsin, right across the border of Iowa, and Crystal is one of the most inspiring cyclists that I know. She's now kind of the face of salsa bikes.
Okay.
And anyway, Crystal and her husband wanted to meet in Farley, Iowa, which was flat and which was going to be the perfect first ride for me coming off spine surgery. And so I thought that they would be a great couple. I mean, they're so inspiring to ride with and to hear their story of how cycling has kind of opened up doors for them. And so I met them in Farley, and I basically unloaded my fat bike, and out of the woods came the most beautiful yellow lab, and his ear was hanging off. He was covered in ticks.
Oh.
And I didn't know what to do because I love animals, but I also wanted to ride, and it was my first ride. And so I called the police chief and said, hey, we're ready to ride bikes and we have this stray dog here. And so the police chief like rolled up and basically said, I don't know what you want me to do. Like, it's, the
Ugh.
Humane Society's closed. So I didn't know what to do. And so I sacrificed my first ride and took this dog home, put him in my truck, loaded him up, took him back to Dubuque. Long story short, I kind of fell in love with the dog. Or I mean,
Yeah.
I did fall in love with the dog. And so after about 2 or 3 weeks of letting him heal and trying to find if he had owners and taking him to Humane Society, I eventually ended up adopting him. And so that's where he gets the name Farley, is because Crystal and I found him in Farley, Iowa on my very first bike ride after spine surgery. If you follow me on social media, you'll see that Farley loves to bike. He's gone on adventures with me in Iowa. We rented, I think one of the coolest experiences that the two of us had is that we rented a no frills cabin in White Rock in Iowa, White Rock Conservancy,
Mm-hmm.
and just spent an entire weekend outside of Des Moines mountain biking together and sleeping in this primitive cabin. And we invited some friends and they came along for bonfires and for mountain biking and gravel riding. And so he's really become kind of the bike dog that I thought he would be. And so he's perfect. And I think without the cycling community of Iowa and without the cycling scene in general, I don't know that I would have rescued him or would have a dog in my life.
Yeah. Oh, way to go, Farley.
Yeah.
He found the right person to come out of the woods and see.
Yeah.
Oh, that's awesome. Oh, that's a really good story. Okay, last question. Any biking advice you can offer people after listening to this podcast?
I think just go out and ride whatever bike you have. I think
Yeah.
one of the questions that comes up a lot for me is, what kind of a bike do I need? And I don't think it's necessarily what bike you need. I think it's the bike that you have or the bike that you can afford.
Mm-hmm.
My very favorite bike that I've ever owned was $1,000. It was a Niner RLT, which stands for Road Less Traveled. And I rode that bike so much. In fact, I sold that bike when I got my Warbird a few years ago. And when I got hit by the car this last year and my Warbird was damaged, the first thing that I did was reach out to the person that I sold it to, asking if they were interested in selling it back to me.
Really?
And I think that, I think that we often think that, we don't have a nice enough bike or we don't have enough money for a nice bike or the bike that we have isn't right. And I think that the best advice that I have is to just take the bike that you have and ride it anywhere, ride it
Mm-hmm.
on what you can. I mean, if you have bigger tires, try to ride gravel. If you have a mountain bike and were like me in college where I rode my mountain bike to work or to school every day and, around the Northern Iowa community, maybe try to see if you can do a single track trail on it or maybe try to do some gravel on it. I think that oftentimes people get scared and think that they don't have the right bike for the job. But I don't think that there is a right bike. I think it's just the joy of being out biking. And I think, we know as people that have done Ragbri a bunch or people that have partook in Ragbri, we know that it doesn't matter what bike you have. It's the fun you have. It's the training on the bike. If you really get into it and are thinking about racing, then maybe you upgrade later. But I think find a group, search on Facebook. That's one of the things I do when I travel. And one of the things that I do when I moved here is find all the local cycling groups. Start exploring events on Facebook that are based on cycling because it's a really inclusive community. Go into shops. Now that shops are opening again, I've made sure to go in and introduce myself and say, I'm new to Colorado and, even, we're so tempted in the age of COVID or even, just in our internet society to buy everything online. But I also think it makes sense to go into the local shops, even if it's for something small like a bicycle tube, because you'll meet people and you'll get advice from them, on where to ride or maybe some of the hidden gems in your community.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it's worth supporting the shops. I think it's worth finding groups on Facebook, and I think it's worth riding whatever bike you have.
I completely agree. There's nothing better than a local bike shop for, immediate needs, but also down the road needs, whether it be, like you said, finding a group to ride with or, emergency maintenance on your bike. I completely agree.
Right.
Awesome. Do you have any organizations or nonprofits that you want to give a quick shout out to?
Maybe I'm a little bit biased because I did so much riding with them in Des Moines, but I love Bike Iowa. I love everything Scott's doing. I love everything that whole group is doing for advocacy. I think they're super inclusive in the Des Moines community. There's so many good bike teams in Des Moines, and they're one of them. I mean, there's too many to name. I mean, there's Bella Rosa and Sakari and everybody like that. That's just so inclusive and so inviting.
Mm-hmm.
But I think what Bike Iowa is doing for the Iowa community is great in terms of maintaining a calendar, in terms of, just a few weeks ago, I tuned into the Facebook Live and Instagram Live Ride of Silence that they put on.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's definitely, if you're looking for rides, if you're looking for routes, or even if you're just looking to support Iowa, I just ordered some Bike Iowa gear from the website because I want people to know here, that, I'm Bike Iowa, or that, where I'm from.
Mm-hmm.
I'm proud of my state. And I want people to know here, that I support that state. And so if you're looking for gear, rides, or events, it's definitely a website to check out. And also the advocacy that they do for the community is great. And one of the things too, I guess the last thing I'll say about Iowa is that they're really good for having bike libraries or for having, coalitions that support biking.
Mm-hmm.
I know the bike library in Iowa City. There's a bike library in Dubuque. In Des Moines, there's the Street Collective. And so those are also worth supporting. And also, if you're looking for a bike, those are great places, if your budget is tight, to go in and see what they have. Or also, a lot of times they'll have like open maintenance nights. And so those nonprofits are great in terms of getting everybody on bikes, all genders, all races, all ages, all budgets.
Agreed. And back to Bike Iowa, Scott Sumter just started a YouTube channel, which is pretty cool. I think he's, at least the time of this recording, he's only done a couple episodes, but it's exactly what you just described as far as Bike Iowa goes.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, Chris, thank you so much for being on the podcast. I love your passion for Iowa and for cycling. And of course, I'm super jealous that you're now in Colorado.
Yeah, well, if anybody wants to visit, they know how to reach me on social media or through you or through any avenue, because I'm happy to show it off, but I also definitely miss Iowa, and I can't wait until it's a little bit safer to travel and there's group rides and events again and races, and I can't wait to make my return and also see how different it is to ride when you can breathe normal. And
right.
Here, sometimes I feel like people are on my chest when I try to breathe because it's just the air is so thin.
Right.
But definitely, if people want to come and experience Colorado Springs or any part of Colorado or Manitou Springs where I live, it's a perfect place to ride.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Chris.
Thank you. I'll talk to you later.
Well, that's it for this week. A big thank you to Chris for being on the show to talk about cycling and, of course, his love of Iowa adventures. He spoke a bit about Bike Iowa, and their website is simply bikeiowa.com. If you have a topic or the name of a cyclist you find interesting, email me at MurphologyPodcast@gmail.com. You can go to MurphologyPodcast.com to find good info, and I recently launched a YouTube channel, so if you want to see videos of the places I bike, check that out. I'll leave you with this quote from the Unwritten Book of Murphology. This quote is from today's guest, Chris Welch. "You don't need the best of bikes. Take the bike you have and ride it. Ride it anywhere. Think about it."